Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Jen Judson, coming to you today from our studio in Washington, D.C. Joining me today is Bradley Bowman, Senior Director of Foundation for Defense of Democracy's Center on Military and Political Power. And joining us virtually from Honolulu, we have Mark Montgomery, Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation at FDD. President Trump issued an executive order to establish an Iron Dome, or a shield for missile defense of the homeland, in his first week in his second term as president. We're here to talk about what this might look like and what it means for the future of missile defense of the homeland and beyond. Brad and Mark, thank you for joining me again. Can you provide some broad brushstrokes on what Trump is calling for in his executive order here? How does this pivot from previous approaches to missile defense of the homeland and what we have now?
There's a lot of nuance here, and I think some of the nuances being missed in some of the popular reporting, and I really appreciate how you dig into the details. I'll start with the name. The Iron Dome name, I think, is a little unfortunate because it creates some confusion and easy opportunities for critics. But I think a lot of people are kind of missing that there is actually something of value going on here. And when I say that, what I mean is that our homeland, which is, as President Trump said in his first national security strategy in his first term, is, there's a responsibility to protect the American people and protect our country. I mean, at the most basic level, isn't that the most important job of the Department of Defense? And so I agree with that. And this is, to some degree, an effort to kind of act on that impulse that was codified in their first national security strategy. And so I think that's good in terms of interest. And then from interest, we know in strategy, you go to threats. And the reality is that our adversaries, what we're calling at FDD, our axis of aggressors adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, each of them in their own ways to different degrees have been undertaking serious, comprehensive efforts, sometimes sprinting, to field more capabilities to hit us here at home, both in terms of what older folks will remember as kind of nuclear ICBM level, great power stuff, but also conventional strikes, which might be a new concept for many Americans, and not just ballistic missiles, but also hypersonic and cruise missiles. And the reality is that if our adversaries think that they can hit us here at home, they may believe that we're deterred in terms of defending our interests abroad. And so a lot of, I think, people kind of just thinking of this at a superficial level, they might think of aggression in the Taiwan Strait or in Europe and the Middle East as disconnected. I don't see them as disconnected at all, because if you think about our essential strategy during the Cold War, mutual assured destruction, that's essentially a strategy of deterrence by punishment. In other words, we never thought we would be able to shoot down all of the Soviet Union's ICBMs. Reagan famously proposed the Strategic Deterrence Initiative, or Star Wars. That was widely mocked, but an important conversation. And my point now is the threat has evolved to such a significant degree and is so much more serious, and our adversaries are becoming so much more capable to hit us here at home in a variety of ways. I think we can no longer over-rely solely on deterrence by punishment. We have to increase our deterrence by denial. And we know that when you combine those two sub-elements of deterrence, then you have more. And so we want to avoid a scenario where Xi Jinping, the People's Republic of China, says, okay, it's 2027, 2028. It's time to roll the dice in the Taiwan Strait and go for it. And if you think about what some of the war plans might be, there might be a need to hit China in their mainland. Well, if we hit them in their mainland, they might hit us in our mainland. And if we have no means to do anything about that, that might affect their decision to undertake aggression. So protect the American people at home, and also understand how what we do here is going to affect decisions related to aggression abroad.
Mark, I'm going to let you take it away too.
Thanks. I agree with what Brad said, and I'd go a little further and say this is a recognition that the adversaries can bring, and I'd throw cyber in here too, that we're no longer, our homeland's not just susceptible to a terrorist threat. We're now susceptible to peer adversaries using cyber tools and missile tools to impact our ability to generate forces to fight. In other words, hit our mobility systems, our transportation systems, hit our airfields in the United States. This has happened because China and Russia have invested aggressively in hypersonic maneuvering missiles. These aren't the hypersonic missiles you hear about in the Russia-Ukraine fight. These are hypersonic missiles that are going, faster than Mach 5 and also maneuvering. And they defeat the ability of our Aegis, THAAD, Patriot systems to intercept them. So they've made significant advancements in that. And then the Chinese are developing systems, ships, submarines, aircraft that and go farther and farther from their coast, much like the Russians do already, to launch cruise missiles at us. So we now have a cruise missile threat, a hypersonic threat, and we have no defense against hypersonics. And our only defense against cruise missiles is in the area you two are sitting right now, in the National Capital Region. We have a very limited cruise missile defense capability. So what the president's executive order recognizes is that we actually have to design and architect a defense of the critical assets of the United States. That's not all of the United States. It's the critical assets of the United States against this emerging Chinese and Russian threats, and we need to do it pretty fast.
Now, one of the things I thought was striking about the executive order, and something I've thought about a lot in the past, is why is our homeland defense focused on rogue nations like Iran and North Korea and not on Russia and China? Those seem to be, our focused adversaries right now, near peer adversaries. So it was refreshing to see that the focus is now much broader. It's we've got to keep our eye out on our capabilities versus Russia's and China's capabilities. And in addition, like you said, more of a focus on cruise missile threat or unmanned aircraft systems that could pose a threat to the homeland as well. So it went a lot broader, which was good to see. One of the things, though, I thought was interesting about the executive order is it requires an architecture kind of be put in place, proposed within 60 days. Is that time frame doable, given, I guess, some of the groundwork that's been done on some of these things in the past? Talk a little bit about meeting this particular deadline for establishing something quite complex here.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and eager to hear from Mark as well, who I know will have lots of great thoughts on this. Those who read the executive order carefully saw the 60-day element that you just referred to, and they also saw that and they may have also observed that a request for information from industry went out with a due date of February 28th, which is 2 weeks from today. So talk about a quick turnaround. Yeah. And those of us who are used to the timelines and defense acquisition and this sort of thing realize that that's like light speed. And so, I'm confident that the various elements of the Department of Defense are jumping on this because when they have clear direction from the Commander-in-Chief. But haste can make waste. And so I suspect they're going to want to meet these deadlines, but there's going to be a lot of action following these deadlines to kind of clean up initial messes and refine and that sort of thing. But I actually kind of, we can debate whether 60 days should have been, 120 or, whatever. Mm-hmm. But I kind of like it at the broadest level because one of my biggest concerns really across the board, whether I look at, our arsenal of democracy, our defense industrial base, acquisition policy, security cooperation, is just a lot of patriotic, hardworking people, but a lack of urgency, just a significant lack of urgency. I'm not saying anyone's deliberately trying to slow things down, but when I scan the geostrategic environment and I look at what the bipartisan, congressionally mandated National Defense Strategy Commission said about the geostrategic situation being more daunting right now than anything we've seen since 1945, and looking at some of the timelines for potential additional aggression, I think the one thing we don't have is time. And I'm reminded of George Marshall's famous quote that is overused when he was Army Chief of Staff: when I had the time, I didn't have the money, and when I had the money, I didn't have the time. And so I think a clear signal from the Oval Office saying this is a priority, this is an unaddressed threat, and we better hurry up, and I expect you to deliver quickly, I think is positive.
When we come back, more from our experts on the future of missile defense. Stay tuned.
Now, Senators Dan Sullivan and Kevin Cramer introduced a very detailed bill on the missile defense shield, had a lot of very specific areas that they wanted to pursue. It also would authorize $19.5 billion for FY26, which comes to nearly twice as much as MDA's request of $10.4 billion in FY25 for their entire budget. So that's a lot of money in FY26. Given what we've heard about, potential to slash the defense budget, I don't know how true that is yet, but how does this stuff get accomplished? That's a huge amount of money in 1 year. What are your thoughts about affording to do some of these things initially?
Why don't I go with that first, Brad? So look, we just saw Senator Sullivan's, eponymous Iron Dome Act, looking to do the executive order. I think it short circuits the process. There's a lot of good ideas in there. There's ideas that we can talk about with dirigibles, with how to do hypersonic defense, with space-based elements of defense. But 70% of the budget is tied up in GBI, ground-based intercept fields for the traditional North Korean, Iranian threat. So I don't think that's the eventual plan that's going to come from MDA or the eventual legislation that's going to come from Congress. I think there may be some investments in GBI, but it's not going to be 12, 13, 14 billion dollars. And it's not going to be 60, 70% centered in Alaska. It's going to end up being a broader effort that gets at these unique developments by China and Russia that drive the president's thinking on this to do an Iron Dome. So it'll be helpful. It gets the juices flowing in Congress. It'll get discussions in the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I think elements of that bill will find themselves in the FY26 National Defense Authorization Act. But I think the largest components of it are probably going to be trimmed or removed.
What components do you think have the most promise to end up in the final version of the bill?
So I think we have to review the glide phase intercept decision. So there are two ways to do glide phase intercept. I mean, there were two programs going. We down selected a little early last summer. One of them
about a year early, correct?
Yeah, correct. And so what happened is there was two programs. One of them will deliver glide phase intercept. So that's our ability to intercept a hypersonic cruise missile in the glide phase. Congress ordered DoD to have that done by 2029. There was a program that could be done by 2029. It probably is not the best system. There's a second system that can deliver in the mid-2030s that is a pretty cool system. The problem, of course, is we can't call Russia and China and say, could you slow your roll? We need an extra 4 or 5 years. The right solution was to continue to work both, go into low rate production on the first one, turn to the second company and say, look, you got a better product. If you can deliver on time or early, we'll order more of your product. Historically, on time and early are not the two choices on the bingo card for delivery of complex weapon systems. But, in other words, put competition in the process. Look, MDA couldn't do that because DoD didn't give enough money to proceed with both. They basically forced it. So I think the immediate things are redressal of that decision, fully fund both programs in terms of research and development for one and low rate production for the other, and get moving. If I could give you one other that really needs to be done is dirigibles and aerostats. We had dirigibles, over DC protecting us in a system Army system called J-Lens. It's basically an enormous firing quality track radar. It could be a TPY-2, it could be something else at 10, 20, 40,000 feet. Brad is an aviator, my wife is an aviator. They know being at altitude has a big advantage on radar ranges versus, say, my Aegis ship that I commanded. So we understand the value of this altitude. They're unmanned, their cost is lower, their production costs end up being lower. You don't need as many environmental impact studies. All these kind of things lend itself to dirigibles. What doesn't lend itself to dirigibles is they're not cool. So no service goes and hugs them. Seriously, this is the issue. It's a sense the Army walked away after a zero casualty incident from this system. On the other hand, the Israelis have it. We're selling them to Poland, telling them they need them for their defense against Russia. It turns out we're going to need them, and we're not going to need one or two. We're going to need dozens. They won't all be up at the same time, but with them around Alaska, in New England, down on our southern border, a few other places, these dirigibles will give us firing quality track solutions to inbound cruise missiles and some support against the hypersonic missiles. So for me, those two big investments are things you could do now. They exist. And get moving, and so I expect MDA in their first epoch and the fiscal year 26 budget to kind of reflect those two at a minimum.
When we come back, our financial expert is back with advice for first-time car buyers. Don't go away. Welcome back. Buying your first car doesn't need to be intimidating. Jeanette Mack from Navy Federal Credit Union has tips on how to prepare before you shop.
Buying your first car is the first big purchase for most people and one of the most exciting, especially if you've done it on your terms. How do you do that? Before you buy, you've got to be ready, be smart, and be in control. To be ready, you've got to make sure you've got the budget to own a car, including gas, insurance, and maintenance. If you don't have an established credit history, you may need to add a cosigner to get a better rate. Once you're financially ready, then you've got to do your research to know what car you want and you can afford. Check into new and used cars, or maybe a lease if you don't rack up miles. Now, be smart. Before you even step foot in a dealership, you should get pre-approved for your auto loan from a trusted lender. Pre-approval means secured financing with a lender ahead of time. And when you're pre-approved, you show up at the dealership as a serious buyer with financing on hand that's as good as cash. That's the way to be in control. And when you're in control, you can negotiate a better asking price. And there's nothing like getting the car you want at the price you want. So when it's time to buy your first or your next car, make sure it's on your terms and enjoy the moment.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, grab your rucksack and trek towards militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more headlines. And to be the smartest airman in the silo, sign up for our early bird brief, compiled each morning bringing you the most recent headlines. Lastly, if social media is where you collect open source intelligence, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. And if you get your news by endlessly scrolling with your thumb, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well.
I did want to pull the thread a little bit more on the executive order. We talked about the very unsexy aerostats and airships that we've seen of yore. But there is something that gets a lot of attention in the executive order, and that is space-based missile interceptors. So I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about the feasibility of these things. I mean, this has been something that's been pushed for in past administrations for decades, but has never really gained traction. Trump tried this in his previous administration. It's back in the executive order as a pursuit. So talk about, is this something that is on the horizon for us? Is it actually a capability that would be useful in defeating some of these newer threats?
So I'm glad you brought up space. It is one of the most innovative parts of the executive order. And I'd break space up into two elements. One is the sensing tracking layer that's critical to hypersonics, critical to large ballistic missile strikes. That has made advances. Both Space Defense Agency and Missile Defense Agency are running systems. I would say it's one of the few times when they're close to delivering on time, in developmental work, and maybe it's because they're competing with each other. Something about that, and so that is fully advocated for in the executive order, and Senator Sullivan does as well. And I think that's being funded and doing well. Eventually, there'll be a little bit of down selecting between some of the systems, but right now redundancy is not an issue. The more innovative part, and something that's probably more about the third or fourth epoch, so to say 5 to 8 years from now, is the idea of using space-based intercept. And you're absolutely right that this has a checkered past. I would say, first of all, technology's really changed. I've been briefed on some systems, unclassified, that I think are very promising. And the beauty is you're relying on God's gift of gravity, vice three rocket motors strapped to the end of a missile to try to get it into above 100,000 feet and into space, and then do a high-speed intercept at Mach 15. So I really like the idea of a space-based intercept. That either, and we're going to have to fight in and through space. There is no international legal prohibition on that. There's an international legal prohibition on nuclear weapons in space that we've signed, but not on fighting in space. And our two adversaries, China and Russia, are aggressively developing these types of weapon systems. So from my perspective, Epoch 1 is still probably about sensing. The next 2 years is about sensing and tracking, and then transitioning in years 4, 5, 6, 7 to the potentiality for engaging. That's the only way to drive down the cost per intercept. Ground-based interceptors are jaw-droppingly expensive,
Yes.
80 million plus. SM-3s, 20 million. THAAD, 10 to 20 million. Arrow 3 from the Israeli side, expensive as well. If we don't have to have all those rocket motors attached, if we don't have to break the bonds of Earth to go do the intercept, we're going to be in a lot better position. So from my perspective, Space-based intercept has got to be one of the most significant engineering aspects of the executive order that may not see itself as an acquisition aspect for 4, 5, 6, 7 years.
I agree with Mark, and I think it's really helpful just to think of it in those two compartments, sensing and striking. And I don't think we can undertake this effort successfully if we don't have a strong space component at the broadest level. And then for members and staff who have folks on the Senate Foreign Relations, House Foreign Affairs committees, let me just add this element, and going back to my idea of needed national champions, is that China and Russia, as we know, have been engaged in activities related to space for a long, long time. And so I think sometimes in the Beltway, there's a tendency, we should or shouldn't do this because our adversaries might respond in a way we don't like. Well, newsflash, they're already doing a lot of these things. And so I don't have a lot of, I try to always be patient, but I don't have a ton of patience for don't do something to defend ourselves, our country, and our citizens because our adversaries might be doing something bad. In many cases, they're already doing it, hello. And by the way, a lot of what they're doing is really cynical. One of the most protected cities on Earth in terms of air and missile defense is called Moscow. It's called Moscow, and it's been that way for a long time. Yeah. And so they have no problem with hypocrisy and cynicism and trying to say that our missile defense is provocative as they build their own, and they brought the same cynicism into this space discussion. China and Russia have collaborated at the United Nations to try to bind our hands with international law about what we can do in space as they're doing the very thing they're trying to bind our hands on. So let's call out the cynicism and hypocrisy, and let's see it for what it is, and let's defend ourselves, and that's going to require actions in space.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a very insightful conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.